Welcome, welcome one and all. Winter Wizard here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how I like to paint skin and skulls for Forge Phobos. Winter Wizard here with just a small amendment. When I was editing the video I realised that I'd lost a couple of clips of footage. So 1,000 apologies for this. This is the part of the video where I would say, thank you for joining me today, whoever you are, and welcome to episode 5 of Painting Forge Phobos, the painting series where I'm unveiling all the secrets, all the tips and tricks to painting the colour scheme of my Adeptus Mechanicus army. It's cold and lonely here in Winter Wizard's frozen fortress, but it's a beautiful day and I've got a lovely cup of coffee over here, kept pre-roast, and I'm joined as always by my friend and co-host, Norwegian Troll, Dimmu, so this is gonna be nice. So I've got a model here. This is the Archmagos Belisarius Cawl himself, and the idea of these painting series is that I do one for every army I collect, and I like to choose a model, a really interesting model that's got a good representation of all the different aspects that you might find across the faction and across the colour scheme. And I break the series into episodes focusing in on a different aspect each time, and if you watch the series from start to finish then you'll also get to see a really cool model painted from start to finish as well. So first of all I'm going to show you what paints we're going to need, and not loads, just a few. So for the skin itself we're going to need lovely base colour of Rakarth Flesh, very nice, and we're going to layer that up with some Palid Witch Flesh. Going to give that a little bit of a wash with some Reikland Fleshshade. That's about it for that. And for the skulls, I'm going to start with some Ushabti Bone, followed by a wash of Agrax Earthshade, some highlights of Screaming Skull, and we might even use a little bit of white here and there as well. So some Corax White, really nice white there. Going to be using that, and that's all we need. So I've zoomed in here, we're going to get started. Got a paint palette there. We're going to start with the skin, I think. So we're going to need Rakarth Flesh first. Just give your paints a good shake. If you can hear a clicking noise there, that's like to buy these 5mm ball bearings. Stainless steel so they don't rust, and you drop one of those in your paint pot and it works like a paint mixer. It's really good at helping to keep your paints nice and mixed and thin. I've got just a little fine detail brush here. It's quite small, the area we're going to paint. So he's got this little arm here. Bits of it, like some of the fingers, are metal. Some of it isn't. Some of it's still flesh, and he's got his little face in there as well. So we're going to just get some of this Rakarth Flesh palette. Make sure it's nice and smooth. Just sort of taking it from the pot, dragging the brush and pulling it, twisting the bristles, get a nice smooth tip, sort of like so. I'm going to start filling in this hand here with some of this. Make sure it's a nice smooth coat. Build up a couple of smooth layers. Bit of a metal prong or wire here, so I'm going to avoid that. We'll just give anything that's flesh a nice solid base coat of the Rakarth Flesh. There we go. That's the hand. He's checking the picture here. Most of it does seem to be skin. He seems to have some sort of, he seems to have like metal rings on, so I'm just sort of leaving those, but picking out most of that with the flesh all around there, as you can see. We'll move on to his face. Be careful not to overload the brush here. And we're gonna just poke a little bit of that in here. Just pick out his nose. be really careful. If the paint is nice and fluid, then you should be able to just sort of poke it and it should run off. Not you know, in liquidy, you know, because it'll run everywhere, but if it's nice and fluid, then it should just be able to just flow off of the bristles onto where you're trying to get it. You'll find this easier. But there we go, that's all I'm going to do. Just going to poke some of that in there, just to get a bit of that face showing. And there we go, we're going to let that dry. I might do another coat, make it nice and strong, and then we'll move on. Okay, that's the skin with the Rakarth Flesh, and we've done another little coat just to make it nice and strong. And now that's dry, we're gonna do some layering. We're gonna bring out the Palid Witch Flesh. And what we're gonna do with this, we're gonna do a nice layer on the skin. Make sure the paint's nice and fluid, and we're just going to paint over what we've done already, but you can avoid the sharpest, you can avoid the deepest recesses, the deepest details, so you don't need to paint right up to all the different edges and things. You don't need to paint in between the finger bones, leave them dark. I'll show you what I mean. So like for the fingers, for example, here we're just painting the tops of the fingers there. Don't need to paint right into the gaps. Leave those a little darker, like so. And this bone, finger up here and there. Give them a nice coat of this, nice and thin, nice and smooth. And after this, we're going to be moving on to some washes. And then another little layery highlight, and then it'll be done. Quite simple, really. There you go, but just start by applying a nice layer of this. Just do all the top edges. Like so. And like in his face. Definitely on that nose. On the top of his nose, a little bit on his cheekbones, top of his head. But you can avoid the eye socket. Leave that nice and shaded. But there we go. So I'm going to go around and I'll finish this off, and then we'll move on. And once the flesh is dry, got a nice smooth layer of this pasty looking flesh here. If you need to do a couple of 2 layers of the Palid Witch Flesh to make it look nice and smooth, that's fine, go ahead. But then once it's dry, and it's important that it is thoroughly dry, we're going to add a nice wash. So we like to use Reikland Fleshshade. Got a bit of blue tack here, just to stick the pot down. I do have a tendency to knock washes over, and they do make quite a mess, so just move that into view a bit more for you, and there we go. So we're going to just apply some of this wash over all the flesh, working it into all the recessed details, things like where he's got this little metal rod sticking in his arm. Good to flood it in there, get nice and dark, so it looks almost like it's a bit tender, a bit sore maybe, and it also just help to make those features pop out. Give him a nice coat of this all over, work it into the details, like in the finger bones there. Flood that in, and they're nice and shaded. And avoid the metal if you can, but if it's not the end of the world, if you go over it, you can always just touch that up. Little bit of that, and as it's drying, just be careful for pooling and puddles forming. You don't want to overload this. So just if you need to, just with the dry brush, just soak up those bits of wash, move them around, or dab them off somewhere on a piece of towel, kitchen paper. Yeah, working that up to those details and giving it a nice coat of this. Nice little wash. It's going to give it a bit of a fleshy tone, while still being quite pasty and pale. You know, almost kind of sickly, I suppose. I don't suppose his skin is in great condition. And poking some of that into his face, flooding that into the eye socket, making that nice and dark. Just getting that in there. But again, you don't want loads, but just enough. There we go. So I'm going to play with this a little bit more, and then we'll leave it to dry, and then we'll move on. There we go. So the wash is now nice and dry. Yeah, last thing we're going to do, we're going to bring out the Palid Witch Flesh again, and just give that a final little highlight. Just making sure we're not overloading the brush, just enough, not loads. And we're just going to pick out those sharp details again. But keep it even sharp at this time. So for example, right on the finger bone here, just on the top where the light would be catching it. Tops of his finger bones and knuckle bones up here. A little bit on the top of his knuckle there. His finger here. And around the top of his wrist and arm here. Just running that down. Bringing that sort of palish colour back, but you still got the warmer undertones and the shaded areas there. A little bit underneath. I don't want the flesh to look too orangey, but just a little bit of that in the shade would look nice. Fingers there. Top here again. Moving round. Catch this side. And like in his face, top of his nose, top of his cheeks, top of his forehead. Leave it at that. And you can't really see much of his face anyway, so just a little bit. And there we go. Just make sure that's all nice and smooth. So bring, and when you're happy, then we can leave it at that. And there we go, that's his flesh. So I do have slightly different methods for painting the skulls across my different factions, depending on the sort of overall feel of the faction or what I want the finish to look like. The Admech, I'm just going for a nice sort of cold bone colour. I'm going to start with Ushabti Bone. I'm just going to load some of this up onto the palette down here. Got sort of a layer brush going on here. And we're just going to give them a nice coat with this to start with. Just give these a nice smooth coat of the Ushabti Bone. Wherever you might find these skulls. And the top. There we are, and the other one. Down here. It's a funny little thing. Picking up a cord or a cable or something. Just give them a nice thorough coat. Nice and smooth. Might need to do a second layer, but might be able to get away with just one actually, I think. There he is. So I'll finish this up and then we'll move on. There they are. I did a second coat, make that first layer nice and make that base layer nice and smooth. And next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to paint straight over the top of that with some Screaming Skull. I want the finished result of the bones in my Admech force to be quite pale. So we're going to go straight on top with some Screaming Skull. And just going to paint over what we've already painted. We've got a nice bone, strong bone foundation. Paint over the top of it, but just don't go into the eye lens, the eye sockets, the nose socket. Leave that dark. Paint everything else. Okay, so I've laid that up with the screaming skull, not going into the eye sockets or really underneath too much. Leave those a little bit darker. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to bring out the Agrax Earthshade again, give it a nice wash. And just going to give this a nice covering of this. Really working it into those eye sockets, into the mouth, underneath. Not going too heavy on this, just a nice sort of smooth covering. If it's too much, then just rinse your brush out, make sure that you can soak up that wash again, like so. Just a sort of gentle wash really, don't go too heavy with it. But like I said, making sure you're getting it into those eye sockets, making them nice and shaded and dark and shadowy, and into the nose, the teeth. Helps sort of bring those details out. So under the cheekbones and things like that. And where it is connected to the metal, you can get a nice bit round there. Make that a little bit darker. And there we go. We'll let that dry, and then we'll come back. Okay, that's the wash, nice and dry, and moving on to almost the final stage here. We've got the Screaming Skull out again. Nice fine detail brush here, or layer brush, whatever you're comfortable with. Just getting some of that on the brush here, and we're just gonna pick out those. I'm just gonna pick out the sort of shape of the skull again. Now that we've got some nice sort of natural dirt shading in there. So for example, like this little ridge here, around the eyes, top of his nose, and the sort of main top of his skull there. I'm going to pick some of that out. Bring a little bit of that pale colour back. Around the top there, like so. And moving around to the other one again. You can sort of see the ridges there, sort of see those sharp shapes. Give some of that around his eye socket, just on the points, sharpy bony bits. And there. There's this sort of shaded recess bit there, so I'm not really going into that, I'm just sort of around it. And the main sort of shape again. Top especially, where the light's going to hit. If you sort of think about the model sitting there, imagine like in the moonlight or something. There we are. So last step, once that's nice and dry, just going to do another very subtle highlight. And for that we're going to keep the Screaming Skull here. We're going to bring out a little bit of the Corax White. And just mix a little bit of that white into the Screaming Skull. Still a bit on the palette here, so I'm going to take some of that aside and make a little bit of a brighter mix. It's pretty much almost white, with a little bit of that Screaming Skull just to take the edge off it. Just bring it a bit more in line with the skull colour. And I'm going to take a bit of that, and again it's just going to be on just the absolute sharpest points. For example, like this ridge here, there, tops of the eyes, and a sort of nice curve around the top of the shape there, like so. You can see that. Just a nice sort of curved reflective line, like there, maybe a little bit on this cheek there, a little bit on his nose. It is very subtle, this, but it is nice. I think it's worth doing, but it's up to you, if whatever you're happy with, you know. And the skull up here, top of his eyes, around his cheek, a little bit there, just on that sharp sort of his eyebrow sort of ridge, a little bit around his mouth there. I've gone a little bit heavy on this one. And there's a nice sort of reflective shape of the skull there, a little bit there. And maybe a little bit on top. Just a smidge. Just move a bit of that off. And there we go. There they are. Well, that's the skulls, just a series of layers and some highlights. And I think they're quite nice. I think they really pop. Yeah, I'm pleased with those. And there we go, this is the finished result. We've got the skin there on the arm, sort of pasty pale flesh with the shaded tones coming through in the recesses, a little bit in his face there. So for the skin, just a case of Rakarth Flesh and some Palid Wych Flesh, washed with Rakarth Fleshshade, and some Palid Wych Flesh highlights. And then the skulls, the Ushabti Bone, followed by some Screaming Skull, Agrax Earthshade wash, Screaming Skull highlights, and then Screaming Skull mixed with some white, or white mixed with a little bit of Screaming Skull rather, for some extra fine highlights. And there we go. And that's how we do it. Okay, there we have it then. So that was episode 5 in Painting Forge Phobos, where in this episode we had a little look at the skin and skulls on Belisarius here. He's very almost finished now, the Archmagos. We've only got one episode of this series left to do, so I hope you'll join me for that. We're going to be taking a look at how to make the Phobos moon bases. That's right, so whenever I do a base, I always do it to represent the homeworld of the factions. And Forge Phobos live on the moon of Mars, Phobos, so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing a nice greyish rock here, and then Belisarius will be done. So I hope you might join me for that, and if you haven't checked out some of the other episodes in this series, I hope you'll do that also. And if you have enjoyed the video today, then a like and a comment would be very, very much appreciated. And if you'd like to see more of what goes on here inside the Frozen Fortress, then perhaps you'll also consider becoming a subscriber. And once again, whoever you are, thank you very, very much for joining me today. I'm Winter Wizard, that's Dimmu, and for now, keep it frosty.